little bit here. So, well, gentlemen, I am humbled and privileged to preach before you today. And I was told I was preaching the pastor's luncheon, and I was like, well, concerning all my experience pastoring in many decades, I'm going to share some things that might help you all. So, I just graduated out of college, 4 years out of college from American Baptist this past spring. And as Pastor Dickett said, I'm running a school in Chicago. I'm now pastoring a church there for the time being. But I said, I desire to reflect on the importance of your calling. Most of you here are pastors, pastoring in parts of the country, Africa. And the importance of the calling, and instead of more of a challenge, I really just wanted to be more of an encouragement, while also expressing my thank you and gratitude for answering your calling. So we're going to start off, we've got some biblical examples, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter number 12. We've got 3 men. Genesis chapter 12 is the call of Abram, who soon be later called Abraham. And we're going to see the responses to their calling by God. Each one of these men that we're talking about all are called of God to do a great work. And all were able to do their great work through God, by God. But that only happened because they answered God's call. So, starting in Genesis chapter 12, verse number 1, Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. In this passage here, God gives, in the previous chapter, we see no special thing about Abram and why specifically he was chosen out of the family of Terah to be used to start the nation of Israel. Why could it not have been Abram's brother? Why could it not have been a different family? Why God chose Abram, we don't know for sure. Obviously, in God's foreknowledge, He knows whom He's going to call and who's going to answer those calls. In this passage, we see an immediate response and obedience to that calling that God gave Abram. In verse number 4, the Bible says, after God had given him what exactly was expected and what was to become of Abram, it simply says, So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot went ahead, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Abram at this time was an old man, well up in his 70s, and now in America, the average life expectancy is between 70 and 75 years of age. If this was nowadays, Abram would have been at the end of his life, and God's called him. God didn't call Abram when he was 12, 21, 42. For some reason, God waited until he was 75 years old to be called. But the neat thing we see is that initial immediate obedience that Abram gave God. The next biblical example we see is in Exodus chapter number 3, the calling of Moses. Exodus chapter number 3. Passage, Moses is out in the desert. He has fled from Egypt because he tried to act in his own way to try helping our situation. He beheld an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. He killed the Egyptian. The following day he saw 2 Hebrew men conflicting with one another. He tried to stop it, but then they said, would it kill us like he did the Egyptian? And Pharaoh heard news of what he had done, and he fled for his life. It was out in the wilderness for many years. Perhaps maybe during that time he spent out in the wilderness, he maybe thought that he was a failure. I don't know. But we see here, as he's wandering throughout his day, he comes across the burning bush. He has the burning bush experience, and in verse number 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt. and I've heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land into a good land, and large, unto a land full of milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and Amorites, and Perizzites, and Hivites, and Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me. I have also seen the oppression where the Egyptians were. Come now therefore, I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee, when thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said to God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say to them, The God of your fathers hath sent thee unto you, they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said to Moses, I am that I am. He said, Thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God begins to give what exactly he's going to do in that land, and we skip down to verse number 22. For every woman shall borrow her neighbor and of her that sojourn in her house jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And ye shall put them upon your sons, upon your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. Chapter number 4. Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. They will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto me. We see here, I like to call this the delayed response to the call. God had called Abram. Abram has an immediate obedience and follows that calling. No questions asked. He's 75 years old. He's sojourning in the land. He's with his family. God calls him out of Ur to go into the wilderness. Moses, God gives Moses attention to the burning bush. He tells him what exactly he wants to do. He wants to deliver the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And Moses gives what I call the delayed response, because he begins to blame himself. He begins to realize, I can't do that. Perhaps maybe Moses thinking of the last time he tried to help out his fellow man. How it didn't go over so well. How it almost cost him his life. And how he had fled to the desert. I honestly believe that Moses would have been very comfortable to remain with his father-in-law serving in the wilderness. God calls him out, but it seems though he keeps giving God excuses as to why he can't do what God's called him to do. I understand, honestly, sometimes I can be a little bit this way. I don't have much confidence in myself or my abilities. And sometimes when God calls us to do a great work and wants to do something hard or difficult, we oftentimes go through our past experiences and saying, that didn't go over so well last time I tried. But if we can evaluate when we perhaps maybe did that, we acted in our own power. We didn't consult with the Lord. We didn't learn from Him. We didn't rely upon Him. And sometimes God allows us to go through those things to not trust in ourselves. The Bible says, Him that thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. Moses was right in recognizing his inability to do the work of God, but he was wrong in not trusting in the power of God to do the work that God had called him to do. The next person that we're going to look at is Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter number 3. 1 Samuel chapter number 3, starting in verse 1. Samuel, his backstory, obviously, he was dedicated by Hannah to be a servant of the Lord. He was a miracle child that was given to Hannah. Starting in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 1. And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days, and there was no open vision. Coming out of the book of the Judges and Ruth, it's almost as if that the word of the Lord, the revelation of God's word, was almost scarce during that time. There didn't seem to be as many prophets and prophecies being given at that time. The word of God says that the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. But God was growing up and preparing a young boy named Samuel at this time. About to came to pass at that time, when Eli was laid down in his place, his right hand waxed dim. that he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep. But the Lord called Samuel. He answered, Here am I. And he ran to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou callest me. And he said, I called not, lie down again. And he went down and lay down. And the Lord called him again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And he answered, I called not, my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived the Lord had called the child. Therefore Eli said unto Samuel, Go lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, but thou shalt speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood and called at his other time, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth. We see this calling on Samuel's life, and this was unique with the others. And this repetitive calling. Samuel was obedient, but he didn't know where God was coming from. But Samuel was waiting for the call of the Lord. He was ready and waiting for God's call on his life. You see, remember we had Abram. We don't know why God chose him, but he did. And Abram had immediate, obedient response to God's call. We had Moses, who had a delayed response. Moses did, therefore, carry out the word of the Lord, but he had more of that delayed response. Then we see Samuel. Samuel was ready and waiting for the call of God. And I say, where are we going with this calling? Folks, gentlemen, I respect the fact and I'm thankful that you all have answered God's call in your life, the pastoring the churches that you pastor. I'm thankful by the fact that at some point in y'all's lives, whether or not you had an immediate response to God's call, maybe you had a delayed response where you had to wrestle with it for several weeks, maybe several months, maybe several years. Or perhaps maybe you were really young and you knew that was in your heart and you were waiting for God to call you to this field or to the church that you pastor. And pastors, I'm thankful that you all have answered God's calling. As I must say, from a young man's perspective, we need pastors. I needed a pastor. Just from personal illustration, there's a man who surrendered his life and answered the call of God in the 1970s to go to the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. That country happens to be my country of Haiti. Haiti at that time was not the place he wanted to go to. Diseases, distress, destruction, and poverty. Okay? As I said, there's a lot of similarities between Haiti and Africa. And this man, by the name of Brother Fred Wall, answered God's call in his life. In the 1970s, he left a good job, a good place in America, and went to my country, Haiti, and began to start churches. It wasn't until the late 90s, in the year of 1998, that I come across his path as an orphan boy. I was an orphan. My mother, when she gave birth to me, she passed away during that process. My father was nowhere to be found. I'm not sure the whole story on that side. But there was a medical team who helped in my delivery, and they reached out to this missionary and asked him if he'd be willing to take in a child. And sure enough, this missionary, because he answered God's call, leaving his country and going to Haiti, he got me in a position to where I was helped. And I lived and survived. I think back, had he not answered God's call, I probably would not be standing before you today. But if he had, maybe I'm not sure if he delayed the call, but if he did not answer God's call in his life, I guarantee you, he would not have been there when I needed him. Because he was there in that position, he answered God's call. I was put in a position to where a family in the States would then come down and adopt me and take me home back to the States. There was a man later in life whom his father was a pastor of a small church in Michigan. He took a church called Bethlehem Baptist Church, his father did, but then years down the road, his father got cancer in his body. This young pastor's son graduated Bible college, was serving at a church down in Indiana as a youth pastor, working a decent job and doing his thing, but his father contracted cancer. And he was given dead not too long. And so this young pastor's son sat in a room with his father. His father's son asked him, "Who do you think will be the next pastor of Bethany Baptist Church?" His father said, "I believe you are the next pastor of this church." This pastor's son hesitantly, "You're crazy. The cancer's got to your brain. I don't think God's called me to preach. I don't think God's called me to pastor." But his father was certain that he would be the next pastor of the church. His father passed away, and sure enough, the church voted him as next pastor. He's been the pastor of the church that I grew up in, Bethany Baptist Church in Sheridan, Michigan, for the past 20 plus years. Because he answered God's calling, I was able to grow up in that church. I got saved at the age of 10 years old. I felt God calling me to missions when I was around the age of 12. And God began to move a burden on my heart for missions under that pastor's leadership. Another example, as I began to grow up as a teenager, and my heart began to get really heavy burden from missions. And as Brother Mickey said, I began to really study out East Africa and Haiti and the similarities. I read about the Great Congolese War, the Sudanese conflict that resulted in the independent state of South Sudan, the Somalian conflict back in 1994, and all these other places. I began to wonder and worry. I lie awake at night and realize, there's young people that I've been in their same exact state. I've been born in that country. I was born in a country that was very poor and impoverished. I wasn't an orphan, but someone answered God's call and went to my country, and because of them, I am here today. Pastors here in Kenya, and I was so thankful to see the work going on over here, because it revealed to me that, yes, there's a lot of bad going on in some of these places. A lot of destruction, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of warfare. But I'm so thankful there's pastors in these areas to where they can reach other young men just like myself. So if you pastors can reach the youth or the people in your communities, well, that's one less young boy to get reached by the warlords. That's one less young girl to be sold into the Islamic slavery. That's one less young person to be given off into drugs and the violence and to have that tribal mentality of thinking that he's the best and that no one else is like him. And I was encouraged to see that a group of pastors that were willing to go to some of the roughest places in our world and preach the gospel in churches. It encouraged my heart. I say all that to say, number one, thank you for answering God's call. I just want to stress the importance that we need pastors like you as a young man in my life, because guess what? You're what helps grow and enable us to carry out that next step. Now, young man, I'm 23. I have the privilege now to teach young people in the inner city of Chicago. We had two sets of twins. Last minute, our school was looking at only around about 14. And last minute, two sets of twins and their parents joined our school out of the public school system. I saw an opportunity to see that's 4 more young people less likely to end up. We had 2 girls. That's 2 girls less likely to end up pregnant by the time they're age 16. That's 2 girls less likely to end up living in a dependent state of life because they weren't taught how to read or to write. We have 2 young boys now in our school down in elementary. Those boys are much less likely to grow up getting involved in gangs. They're much less likely to end up incarcerated by the time they're 18. They're much less likely to live a life of violence and wickedness. Because now, as a church and a school, we get to influence their minds in the preaching of God's word. I say all that to encourage your pastors to continue the work that you're doing. Be faithful to God's calling in your life. Because you have answered God's call, you are helping change lives. Pastor, I just want to say one last time. Thank you.
Yeah.